Today we are looking at a case from the 1870s. So sit back as we go to Canada. Phoebe McWayne was born in 1847 into a modest family who had a small farm in the close-knit community of Thorndale in Middlesex County in the province of Ontario in Canada. She was the third child, an only daughter, born to Mr. Joseph McWayne and his wife Mary Ann. Sadly, in 1855, tragedy had struck the McWayne household when the youngest child, a little boy named John, died at just 2 years old. At the time, the child mortality rate in Canada for children under the age of 5 was 310 deaths per 1,000 births. Phoebe had some schooling, although it was not until 1871, when the Ontario School Act was passed, that attendance became compulsory for children between the ages of 8 and 14. She would also help her parents and was considered to be a hard worker. She was often seen in the fields, assisting her father, or other times doing chores in the house. And although life was sometimes hard for such a young girl, Phoebe was always known to be polite and courteous, and people often commented on her pleasant character. 1860s Ontario saw a transition from subsistence farming to more organised and commercial methods. This was assisted by improved transportation networks, notably the expansion of the railways, which enabled farmers to gain access to broader markets and allowed for increased trade of crops and livestock. Technological advancements, such as the introduction of mechanical reapers and improved ploughing equipment, enhanced productivity and reduced labour intensity. Furthermore, the establishment of agricultural societies facilitated the spread of knowledge through publications and fairs, which aided the sharing of innovative practices. This pivotal decade laid the groundwork for Ontario's agrarian prosperity, which resulted in a period of notable expansion and advancement in the province's agricultural industry. When Phoebe was 20 years old, she married Mr. George Campbell, a hard-working and earnest young man who had grown up on a neighbouring farm. He was 8 years her senior and married Phoebe against the advice of his father. The McWaynes had an unenviable reputation, and George's family were not pleased that he was marrying Mr. and Mrs. McWayne's only daughter. George ignored the advice of his family, and following the wedding, the couple settled into a simple farmhouse on the outskirts of Thorndale, where they began building a life together. During this era, the rural communities in Ontario were tightly knit, and daily life often revolved around agriculture and family. Community gatherings, local events, and religious services were pivotal in maintaining social connections and contributed to the fabric of Thorndale's social life, helping to build and sustain communities. In the summer months, Phoebe and George worked hard. The days were long, often accompanied by brilliant sunshine. The fields were full of crops, and the banks full of lush vegetation and vibrant flowers. But winters in Ontario were harsh. As temperatures dropped, the snow covered the landscape as farmers faced a series of daunting tasks to ensure their survival and that of their communities. Before winter took hold, crops had to be harvested and stored, livestock cared for and sheltered, and provisions stockpiled. However, despite the formidable challenges, Phoebe always demonstrated remarkable perseverance, and this was shown in her ability to adapt to situations, work tirelessly for hours, and support her husband. Over the next 4 years, Phoebe gave birth to 2 children, a girl named Mary Ann and a boy named David. But life was tough for Phoebe. She had to look after her children, alongside the relentless chores of cooking, cleaning, and homemaking, while supporting her husband's labours. But she rarely complained, and it looked to those who knew them that she provided unwavering dedication to her family, especially when things were not going well. However, beneath the surface of domestic tranquility, cracks began to appear in Phoebe and George's marriage. Financial struggles weighed heavily on the couple, as their modest farm yielded inconsistent crops and meagre profits. As the pressures of rural life took their toll, disagreements turned into heated arguments. Despite this, they were able to maintain appearances in front of family and friends, and Phoebe especially managed to balance public perception and personal turmoil all the time, becoming even more disenchanted with her situation. As the summer of 1871 dawned, tensions between Phoebe and George increased. Their arguments grew more frequent, which left Phoebe feeling trapped in a life that had held so much promise. Rumours had also started to circulate that she was conducting an improper relationship with a young farmhand named Thomas Coyle, who worked for her father. These rumours were always denied by Phoebe. On the morning of the 15th of July, the village of Thorndale awoke to the terrible news that Mr. George Campbell was dead, apparently murdered in front of his wife and children. There was abundant gossip and hearsay as people recounted the story that Mrs. Phoebe Campbell had told the authorities about the tragic events that had unfolded within the confines of her own home. In Phoebe's statement, she said that as her family slept, an abrupt intrusion shattered the tranquility of the night as two black men, wearing dark clothes, entered their log cabin. The intruders targeted her husband, Mr. George Campbell, and demanded money. She said that George told them that he had none. Undeterred, the assailants then attempted to fire a gun. She presumed that they did this as a means of intimidation, but each time they tried to fire, the gun jammed. She went on to say that amidst the tension, George shouted to her to fetch the axe, which she did, only to have it taken from her by one of the assailants. She said that she then got the knife that was kept on top of the bureau, but this was wrestled away from her by the other man. They then both started to attack George. Mrs. Campbell then described how during this confrontation, her husband succumbed to the unrelenting blows from the axe, and he fell to the floor. She told of how she could see blood coming from the cuts in his head. She said that the attackers then hurriedly left, warning her not to leave the log cabin until the morning, or she too would face the same fate as her husband. She went on to say that as soon as they had gone, she went outside screaming for help and went in the direction of the nearest neighbour. Luckily her cries were heard, and Mr. Hugh MacDonald, whose farm was adjacent to the Campbells, came to see what was happening. It was early, between 1:30 and 2 a.m, and he was soon joined by neighbours William Blackmore and Richard Craig. The three men saw George lying on the floor and realised that he was dead. Mrs. Phoebe Campbell added that the gentlemen were very helpful and managed to provide a semblance of comfort during this terrible ordeal. Over the next few days, this tale was recounted throughout Thorndale and the surrounding area, and although it seemed that everyone initially believed Phoebe's version of the events, there were those who began to wonder if this was actually what had happened. The two black men who she had claimed had killed her husband had disappeared, and the authorities had not been able to find witnesses who could say that they had seen them on the days preceding or following the murder. Although in the beginning it had seemed like a straightforward murder case, it now began to look more complex. It had also been noted that during George's funeral, an unsettling sense of detachment seemed to envelop Phoebe. The absence of a visibly emotional response raised eyebrows and was one of the main conversations between those who were in attendance. It was one of George's relatives, Miss Annie Campbell, who provided the authorities with the clue about this puzzling behaviour. While she acknowledged fleeting instances of sorrow, Annie had noticed that Phoebe didn't look as upset as one might think she would have, considering the fatal attack on her husband that happened right in front of her and her children. A lady named Mrs. Mary Freed also told the police that she had seen Phoebe meeting Thomas Coyle in a field near the log cabin on the evening after the murder. This caught people's attention, especially because there had previously been rumours that the two might have been conducting an improper relationship. However, the most confusing element of this tragic event was why Phoebe had remained helpless during the violent assault on her husband. The fact that she did not intervene, seek assistance, or raise the alarm during the attack left many in the community confused and somewhat uneasy. Amidst this atmosphere of uncertainty, Phoebe's story underwent a significant shift. What had once been a straightforward retelling of events was now mired in doubt and speculation. The community found itself contending with an intricate amount of uncertainties. The mixture of reality and made-up details was like different threads in a puzzle that had created a captivating mystery. From the 16th to the 22nd of July, local individuals were interviewed by authorities, notably Mr. Thomas Coyle and Mrs. Phoebe Campbell. The coroner's inquest convened on the 4th of August, and in the course of the inquiry, the juries gathered at the Campbells' cabin. This enabled them to see the confined area where the assault had occurred. The walls and floor gave an impression that a violent attack had taken place, as there were bloodstains on the floor and the walls. The doctor, named Dr. Moore, who had examined the body following the attack, had noted that the wounds must have been inflicted by a strong man. Phoebe was small, but considered to be stronger than many women her size. The jury at the inquest concluded that Mr. George Campbell had been murdered by two individuals, who they believed to be Mr. Thomas Coyle and George's wife, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell. Phoebe reacted to the accusation by standing up and shouting, "I don't care. I am innocent. I don't care." Following this, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell was arrested and held in prison until her trial that was set for the following spring. The trial commenced on the 1st of April 1872 in London, Ontario, and ushered in a wave of sensationalism that gripped the community in an unprecedented manner. As the prosecution and defence made their opening statements, journalists wrote every word in the knowledge that the public would buy their publications, all eager to read about the drama and the intrigue that was unfolding inside the courtroom. Witnesses who had come to help Phoebe on the night her husband was murdered described the scene in the log cabin to the court. They outlined where the body of Mr. George Campbell lay and the amount of blood that was on the floor and the walls. Phoebe had previously made statements to the police, most of which she had later retracted. She said that her cousin, Mr. John McWayne, had owed her husband money, and as George had asked for it to be paid back, and Mr. McWayne was unable to pay it, he came to the log cabin and murdered him. There was no evidence of this, and of course the accusation was denied by Mr. McWayne. In a startling twist, Phoebe decided to cast a shadow over her late husband's character. She claimed that he had been engaged in an affair with her cousin's wife, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. However, the prosecution had their own revelations and introduced a letter that had been written by the defendants to Mr. Thomas Coyle. In the letter, it was evident that her words bore the weight of her emotions. Within its lines, she had written, "I never shall say you done any such thing again, even if I have to die for it." The courtroom atmosphere was tense as this piece of evidence was revealed. During the proceedings, Phoebe's demeanour underwent a perplexing transformation. When queried about the many alterations in her testimony, she strangely reared into the realm of the supernatural. According to her, the ghostly apparition of her deceased husband had graced her with a visitation, absolving both herself and Thomas Coyle of any wrongdoing. Following this statement, there was a murmur from the gallery, but the Crown Attorney's response captured the sentiments of all of those in court when he said, "You can hardly expect anyone to believe such nonsense," his words laden with scepticism. The courtroom was silent for much of the trial, with only the witnesses, barristers, or the judge talking. However, this was shattered as the jury reached their verdict. After only 60 minutes of deliberation, they returned to pronounce the defendant, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell, guilty of the murder of her husband. Tears streamed down her face as the judge delivered her fate. She would be hanged for her crime. She was then returned to prison, where later she made a full confession. She admitted her involvement in the murder, but said that it was Thomas Coyle who attacked George with the axe. She said that they had decided to kill him as they wanted to get married. She went on to say that on the fateful night, she had left the door open so Thomas could enter the house and attack George while he slept in his bed. But the attack did not go as planned, as George awoke and got up to defend himself. She went on to say that he was eventually overpowered by Thomas Coyle and herself, and Thomas continued to hit him with the axe. Some people believed this statement, others did not, but when Thomas Coyle was sent for trial on the same charge, he was found not guilty. Many consider that the main reason for this was because it had become very difficult to find out what had actually happened that night, due to the many different stories that have been told by Phoebe Campbell. Following his trial, Thomas Coyle left Canada and travelled to England. On Thursday, the 25th of June, 1872, Mrs. Phoebe Campbell was hanged in the city of London in Ontario. Her face marked a grim milestone, establishing her status as the first woman to be executed in post-Confederation Canada. Her name now etched in history forever, intertwined with a tale of betrayal and tragedy. The media portrayed her as a heartless figure, devoid of any remorse. Newspapers reported her demeanour as she had ascended to the gallows. It was written that she had an unwavering expression set against the delicate clutch of a lace handkerchief, which lingered for a fleeting moment after the trapdoor had been sprung. Following the execution, the morbid curiosity of the public was fueled by the production of souvenir postcards. These featured images of the crime, trial and execution, and served as lasting mementos of the tragic events that had shocked 1870s Ontario and is still talked about today. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case